Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Eric. Today I'm going to talk about Jurassic Park from 1993, directed by Steven Spielberg and based on the Michael Crichton novel. So, this is one of the biggest movies of the decade for sure, and a historically important film as far as the use of special effects here. I'll talk about that a little bit, but just it launched a franchise, of course, but one of those touchstones of the decade, definitely. So, as I mentioned, this was based on a book by Michael Crichton, which came out a few years earlier. I don't really need to describe the story of Jurassic Park. It's about cloning dinosaurs and starting an amusement park or a zoo, high-tech zoo with actual dinosaurs. It's a great concept for a story. Of course, the method of doing it is that they can find DNA in, is it insects, mosquitoes who have been frozen in amber for millions of years, who still have traces of DNA in them. So that was the genesis of the film. So that's the story, and of course the story is about a group of people who come to spend some time with the park, and everything goes haywire. So, like I said, don't need to do any much of a summary for this film. I do remember I read the book, and I remember it was like one of the first more adult oriented books I read. Before that, I was reading more books for young readers, and Michael Crichton, and someone recommended it to me that, oh, this book's really cool, I think you'd like it. And then I learned a little bit about Michael Crichton, that I knew the movie The Andromeda Strain, and I thought, oh, he wrote that, and and I remember even a local drugstore, going into a local drugstore, they would have a whole display at this time of Michael Crichton books, like Spear and Congo, and I think The Great Train Robbery and the Terminal Man, all of his books. So Crichton was huge in the 1990s. He'd been around since the 60s, 70s, but he was really having a massive impact on pop culture during this particular time. So I remember reading the book, and I remember going to see this film. Came out June of 93, and when I initially saw it, I was a bit cold towards the film. I didn't, because if you've read the book, the book is a little bit nastier. There's a lot more, characters getting, taken by the dinosaurs and all that. So the book is a little bit nastier than the movie. So that was the movie I was expecting, that it would be more of a horror type of movie, and the movie I saw, it felt a bit tame compared to the book. So interestingly enough, Jurassic Park was not a film I watched a lot, really, for a long time. After I saw it in the theater, I wasn't too crazy about it. But in the recent years since, past 10 years or so, I've come around to the film, recognized the film as all the things I said before, important film historically, and I think everyone has experience when you're younger. You've read a book, okay, you really like the book, you go see a movie, and it's not like the book, and you kind of feel a little like, oh, I don't like that, or I was hoping it would be this. So I guess that was my initial experience with that. So a little bit of history there, but no, I've come around to the film, recognize it as a real masterpiece of the form. And I think for science fiction in general, it's a great introductory film to the genre, because it introduces a lot of the bedrock themes of the genre, of science and ethics and meddling with nature, the forces of nature, and the hubris of humanity pushing science too far and leading to unforeseen consequences. I mean, that's really, you can go back to Frankenstein. Mary Shelley deals with those themes, H.G. Wells, and all the way up. So this is a high-tech story in many ways, but it's also very much of those traditional tropes of science fiction. So I know when I was teaching, I would often show this film as perfect introduction to the genre because it gets into those themes so well. And the film telegraphs that, that great scene when they're having lunch, and the Ian Malcolm character, kind of gives a voice to that, where he's the skeptic about all this, and Jeff Goldblum gives his big spiel about meddling with nature and consequences. So that's memorable. So yeah, the film is great. The film telegraphs all those themes, not just in the script through language, but visually. We see that all over the movie, where there's a lot of tension in this film about how far we should push technology, and yeah. So visually, the film's rich in that regard too. It's such a spectacle. This is we're still in the blockbuster era in the early 1990s, and I mean, this was the real breakout film for CGI, where the big obstacle for filmmakers was can you put dinosaurs on screen, and our modern audience is going to buy it. Of course, we've had going back to earliest days of cinema, we can see dinosaurs in silent movies, and then of course the Godzilla films and all the films done by from Japan, the Tojo Studios, and all those films. But it'd often be like somebody in a suit or miniature effects, and those movies are great. They're a lot of fun to watch, but this is a big budget movie where you're going to have dinosaurs, attacking people, interacting with people. So it was really the big challenge of this movie, and it was the CGI technology that provided the breakthrough. Of course, there's also a lot of practical effects in this film, dinosaurs that were built, and so the film is really a mix of the two, of CGI and practical effects. But this was like the scene, the famous scene where Hammond unveils the dinosaurs for the first time, and we get the classic Spielberg look of Sam Neill and Laura Dern and Jeff Goldblum gazing in awe at the dinosaurs. And that's like, if the audiences in 1993 watch that moment and start giggling and start laughing, then the movie's a failure, right? But I mean, you do have the John Williams music behind it, but if audiences watch that and are simply thrilled with wonder, you got them. I mean, and that's just gazing at the dinosaurs. Of course, later on in the movie, where we have the big T-Rex sequence where he's attacking, the cars, and that's classic Spielberg, and the big climax finale where you have raptors and T-Rex. So just really blew audiences away in 1993. And I don't know if anyone, I don't know if I ever heard anyone complain about the effects in this film then. I mean, they might have complained. Reading reviews of the film, I remember a lot of comparisons to Jaws, and a lot of like the older guard of the critics saying that Jaws was a much better film because it was more about humanity, Jaws, whereas Jurassic Park felt more like just an amusement park ride with not a lot to say, really. I mean, those are some of the criticisms of the film, and I suppose those are fair, but yeah, this is such a spectacle, and I think it is interesting to compare with Jaws, watching these films back to back, where Jaws is very much a statement from the 1970s, deals with a lot of preoccupations of that particular era. Jurassic Park is very much of the 1990s, where it's about, the cultures being in awe of technology. I mean, everything coming down the pike, but what is it going to do to us, this technology, right? That seems like over 30 years later, that's what culture is grappling with. Well, what effect is all this technology having on us? And that's one, I think, great angle to watch Jurassic Park, is the ambivalence in the film about the use of technology and how far it should go. So that's one reason for watching it. And I think Spielberg's own his own, I think, ambivalence about it too. Of course, famously, he made Schindler's List right after this film. They both came out in 1993, and Spielberg talked about not liking Jurassic Park because he was making this very serious film, and he's still editing Jurassic Park, and he just felt like the movie wasn't really saying anything. You know, it was sort of using technology to just for thrills and everything like that. But yeah, I do think the Hammond character in the film, played by Richard Attenborough, who is the rich guy, the corporate guy who's funded all this technology, kind of a Walt Disney type figure, who has this big vision of a park and what he can do with this incredible technology. Now, if you read the book, Hammond is a much darker character. He's a lot greedier. He's not really thinking about consequences at all. You know, he's in the film turns him into this very benevolent type of guy who might be misguided, but ultimately is not a sinister figure by any means. And I always think, like, Spielberg does this a lot, where he'll put a character into a film that is sort of like his avatar, like with Jaws. Maybe the Richard Hooper was kind of Spielberg's avatar, or Close Encounters again, Richard Dreyfuss as Roy Neary, kind of Spielberg's stand-in for the story. And I feel like this Hammond is really fulfilling that function in this film, where he wants to use the technology, but he's not thinking about the consequences, and that, of course, that later comes back to haunt the character. But Spielberg, by using all this technology himself, and his excitement, his enthusiasm for what he can do with films, but at the same time thinking about what does this mean for the future of cinema, you know, where a lot of special effects people, practical effects people, are not going to be as needed anymore. You know, there's all these the CGI artists and people behind screens are going to be creating it, and of course that's on steroids today with AI and all the concern about, you know, AI replacing human creativity even in movies. So that's another aspect of the film was interesting, and there's a lot of, like, Walt Disney to Spielberg as well. I mean, his interest in amusement park rides, and, you know, his passion for spectacles and mass entertainment. So that's one other way of reading into the film. Yeah, so, I talked about the legacy of the film a little bit, and I think it is interesting, though, after this. I don't think Spielberg necessarily was interested in pushing the medium forward necessarily with special effects. I guess others would come along to do that. You know, after this, Spielberg became, making a lot of historical films. Of course, he would return to science fiction and like Minority Report and AI, films that really have good effects, but aren't necessarily remembered for their special effects. They're more about the story, and I feel like that's where Spielberg wanted to go, where he wanted to tell stories that were what's the word I'm looking for, that were worthwhile stories for the thinking about the future, and not making just like spectacles and things like that. So yeah. So I think that this is an important film in that regard. So, but yeah, CGI. I mean, I think there's an exhaustion today with it in movies. Of course, when it's done well, audiences will appreciate it. But does anyone want to sit through a big sequence that's all CGI for 20-25 minutes? I think maybe among audiences these days there's somewhat of an exhaustion with that. Maybe a need for more practical effects that look more real. Okay, like, I don't know, like, if younger people today, I think everyone loves Jurassic Park for the most part, but like looking back to the 70s and 80s and like The Thing or movies like that had all these incredible practical effects in them, And I wonder if there is a longing for that, for movies to have a more tactile feel to them. Of course, I guess that would culminate with the Star Wars prequels that George Lucas made, that that were just so going all in on digital technology, and I feel like that almost led to kind of a backlash. But of course, the MCU movies would take that even further with more CGI, and so I don't know. But Jurassic Park's a great dividing point where of how special effects are changing, from moving from the more tactile 1980s, but now moving into the more CGI of the 21st century. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Jurassic Park. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Have a good day.